the kids. We fled domestic violence. Feeling like you know something's gonna happen and it's happening. Calling the police wasn't really an option. And so I called my dad and he helped me get out. Even after that, I was super tempted to go back because that's the only home my kids knew. Ultimately, I told them it was safety, to be honest, because the person knew where we were no matter where we went. I was dealing with a lot of anxiety about stuff too, and having to worry about the kids and being safe and stuff. Not really knowing where you're gonna take your kids or be. It was really hard. Arriving at the Tacoma Rescue Mission, I felt relieved that we had a space to go. And the more that I came here as a resident, I felt like the person that I really am was coming more to the forefront, because the previous situation I had left, I felt like I was losing myself. It felt nice to know that some things that I normally worried about, I didn't have to worry about. Like, I didn't have to worry about the kids feeling like they couldn't be kids. When we got here, they were excited about the great room. They have all these activities and they can go outside at the basketball court. There's the playground in the back. There's so many cool places. Comcast Live Zone was important because it was extremely helpful for accessing resources.
It's so important for us to have access to the internet here, and frankly, we didn't have that. Due to our partnership with Comcast, we've been able to have that now, which has been a huge blessing.
Internet access is literally your whole life. Almost, it feels like nothing can run anymore without internet. If you're in a homeless situation and you're in a shelter or in a program, you have to be able to look for housing, you have to be able to look for jobs perhaps, or if you're looking for assistance of any kind, whether it's mental or education, you have to be able to access it. With Comcast Live Zones, that was pretty awesome because it gave access to all the residents. I did use it to contact my family a lot.
I'm really excited for hear how much she's thriving now. It's just a fantastic testimony to her hard work and dedication, and to the teamwork and the support of the community that came around and was able to support her in this.
Even after leaving, no matter where I go, I can always maybe call someone or come by and say hi and feel like we get each other. And that's what I love the most. They're my family. Nico still says this is his home. If he talks about the homes he has, this is the one he's talking about, and all the friends he made. If he talks about going to his other home, he's talking about coming here. I'm being so serious. I love it.
Hi everyone. Hopefully you've all got your drink and a good plate of food, and we'll just get the last way. I'm Jackie Brophy. I'm with the Seattle City Club. I'll just talk like this. Okay, thanks. And tonight we're going to be talking about the big squeeze, the cost of living challenges in Seattle, which is a topic that obviously affects us all. So before we dive in, I just wanted to thank the staff at the Collective and Bermuda's Media, and also Comcast, our sponsor, for helping us put this together tonight. I also wanted to thank our speakers for taking the time tonight to talk about this really important topic and letting us have your time. And so finally, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Rachel Horgan. She is the founder and host of the Seattle Weekly podcast. And Rachel, I'll let you take it from here.
Perfect. Thanks, Jackie. Yes, hi everyone. Rachel Horgan. I worked at the Puget Sound Business Journal for 5 years, moderating panels on stages, and I've since left and launched my own podcast, The Weekly. If it doesn't come up, you can search The Weekly Seattle. And every episode, I recap the top 4 or 5 Seattle business news stories, and I have a different CEO on each week. So you get to kind of understand what's going on each week, and you get to hear it with some context and get to know a different CEO's story, because I don't know, we make business news a little boring and confusing, and it doesn't have to be. So anyway, that's a little bit about me. I'm really excited for today's discussion. It's going to be a lot of fun, and I'm going to have each panelist introduce themselves. So Daryl, why don't we start with you? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure thing. Thank you, Rachel, and pleased to be here. Thank you, everybody, for coming out on such a beautiful evening. I am Daryl Smith. I serve as Executive Director of HomeSite. We are a place-based community development corporation, as well as a statewide mortgage lender for low and moderate income families here in Washington. And we are a builder. We've built over 500 units of affordable homes, all for home ownership since our founding in 1990.
Perfect. Thank you, Jasmine.
Hi, my name is Jasmine Smith. I'm the Director of Local Advocacy at FutureWise, and we're an organization born out of the Growth Management Act. And that means we work on a lot of different land use policies and how we build beautiful, vibrant cities and protect the nature lands that we love about Washington.
Lindsay?
Notsiam. Hello, friends. I am Lindsay Goesbehind. I'm the Chief Impact Officer at the Seattle Foundation. We are your local community foundation. We've been around since 1946. I have the privilege and honor to lead our impact team, which spends its time making grants to organizations like FutureWise and HomeSite in partnership to move our community towards a more prosperous, thriving, and just place for everyone. We also, as a companion to that work, do some impact investing in housing, in childcare, and transit development.
Perfect. We've got a lot to talk about today, and we're going to talk about what is the goal, what are we driving towards, and how can we, why is this important, why should we care? And then we'll talk about, okay, but where are we at currently? And then we'll kind of close out with how do we get to this goal? How do we get to what we want to be at? So I want to hear in your own words, what does a vibrant community look like to you, and why is it important for all of us? Why should we care if somebody can afford a house in Lake Stevens or Kent? Kind of how does it apply for all of us? So what does a vibrant community look like, and why does it matter? Lindsay, do you want to start with that one?
When I think of vibrant community, I can't help but think about coming from a tribal background, being raised in a tribal community. The way in which I was taught was that it's not enough to have one or a few do really well, right? To be able to take care of themselves, take care of their families, to be able to participate in community, to be able to be a part of all of the beautiful things about our culture, about our ways of life, right? We all need to have a share in that, and we all have a responsibility to participate in that. And so when I think about what that looks like here in Seattle, in King County, I think that, the conversation really is more about what does it take to be a whole, well person, right? To be able to do the things that are going to be healthy, take care of your family, are going to give you purpose, are going to give you meaning. And that starts with basic needs. And, we often really focus on that place, food security, affordable housing and home ownership, accessible transit, accessible childcare, equitable access, right? But it's even beyond that, because all of those things are the basis of a vibrant community, but it doesn't end in that space. Because beyond that, we need to be able to have community connection. We need to be able to be a part of something larger than ourselves to really feel like this community is for me, for us. So I like to think, and at Seattle Foundation, that is a lot of our conversation, is that it isn't just about can you afford the very basic things? That's just where it begins. And how do we continue to resource and build and help bring more folks into the tent of understanding that it is far more than that?
Yeah, well said. Daryl or Jasmine, what does it look like, and why is it important?
Yeah, a vibrant community starts with those basic needs so that everyone has everything that they need in order to not just live but thrive. And then thinking about what that built environment around them looks like, it's children playing in the street, because we have safe neighborhoods, safe sidewalks where they know their neighbors. They have community members looking out for them. The fact that we have corner stores where we can just run to and get all the things that we need, and then drop off our kids at childcare, 15 minutes away, instead of having to cross town because we have such a dearth of childcare opportunities, and they're very expensive. It's that anyone can choose to live in any neighborhood that they want to because it's not too expensive. There's not a secret magic gate around any particular neighborhood. It's that we can all see ourselves there, here, together, and in community, and that we have everything that we need and want at such a microscopic scale that there's a lot of joy in that.
Daryl, what would you add?
I'd love to snap my fingers to both of those answers because they're excellent. And I think for me, when I think about a vibrant community, I'm thinking about a sustainable community. And for me, that is a racially and economically diverse community. And I think here in Seattle, and by extension, King County, perhaps even the Puget Sound region, we've seen a movement away from these visions, a lot of it driven by housing cost. And unfortunately, we find ourselves at the center of that work at Homesite and in trying to come up with strategies across the board that address those areas, not just on creating housing units, but how do we partner with community organizations and neighborhood groups to strengthen their toehold so that they themselves aren't further displaced. Because if we look at housing patterns across our beautiful city going back, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that from this book here in a little bit, we've seen that there's been a real struggle to maintain, I think, what we all would agree we want in terms of a vibrant community. So we've got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw this thing where it was saying, your kid may not be on food stamps, but when some other person's kid comes to the class hungry and is distracting the whole class, that's going to affect your kid. So it's kind of this idea of we don't live in silos. Everything is interconnected in a healthy community, and one area is good for all of us. So we've identified kind of what we're striving towards. What's stopping us? What are our issues? Kind of, what do you think are the top key cost of living issues, would you say? Who wants to go first? Anybody has a thought? Daryl?
Okay, I'll go first. Can I ask the audience for a quick quiz here?
Yeah,
I don't want
yeah.
to take over the host duties. What's the median home price in the city of Seattle? Anybody? I think I heard a million. Did I hear 750? Oh, I so
750?
wish it was 750. No, the median home price, the median, right, is about $1 million, a little over, right? In King County, it's around 950. So if that's the median price, that means more than half of the homes that are available cost even more than that, right? So this is a big problem. We have a very unhealthy housing market here in the city of Seattle. And if we think about the ecosystem like a spine, it's not just homes for sale, it's homes for rent as well. So the driver of housing cost is a gigantic part of the problem here. And we found ourselves in a market, perhaps driven by the fact that we've had historically a pretty good economy here the last few years. Everyone suffers because of this. We have folks that maybe could afford to buy the home in that if they're lucky enough, but maybe they're looking to scale down and purchase a little bit lower, which puts a lot of pressure downward then. So we have a real problem here. And I think that's at the center of a lot of what we're talking about.
Yeah, what about you two? What do you think the key issues are?
Yeah, I mean, I think when most of our budget is going toward, and by budget, I mean our individual budgets. Most of my budget is going towards my rent and whatnot. I'm paying over half my income, or I was at my last job paying over half my income in rent every paycheck. And I had to build my budget and my life around what worked to make things work. And so what that looked like was reducing my transportation costs, and what that can open up is where can I live, and I wouldn't be able to get a car at this point in my life because the cost of rent has eaten up so much of my budget that investing in a vehicle, even if that's something that I wanted in my life, if it's something I needed, that's not something that I could afford. There's all of these factors that start putting pressures on looking at the cost of childcare and how that's gone far beyond now at this point, even sending a kid to college once you have one. There's so many pressures coming in on our budgets as just people trying to survive and make ends meet. And when the cost of housing is going up for every individual, then that cost drives up into small things like the slice of pizza and how much you have to spend to have people be able to live in Seattle as a business owner. And when the cost of the materials, the cost of food, all of these go up in
Right.
different pieces.
It all kind of bleeds into everything. I want to ask you one more question. You work on the east side a bit with your role. Is there anything specific to the east side that you think is an issue for cost of living?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting roles that I play as the director of local advocacy is that there's the Seattle work that we do with the Complete Communities Coalition on the Comprehensive Plan, and then the East Side Housing Roundtable. And there's a lot of similarities in our approaches of bringing people to the table that are kind of unlikely collaborators with Seattle, like House Our Neighbors and the Seattle Chamber, some of our steering committee members, because we all get that the cost of housing is astronomical and needs to be fixed. And same with the Eastside Housing Roundtable. You have the Bellevue Chamber and affordable housing providers at the table to try and address this. So there's a lot of similarities, but I think one of the big differences is the identity as a city and how both the age of the city and what we're doing to kind of make that shift in 2025 to, okay, Bellevue is a city within its own, and how suburban identity bleeds into
Because
the
Bellevue's
big city.
rich is what we're like. It has the perspective is what
But
you're
it's
saying.
also
like,
new.
Yeah, it has the people think that about the East Side is rich, and that's what you're saying. Is like we need to combat that and provide affordable housing. Is that right?
Yeah, I think a lot of people do see high incomes on the east side, but they don't see the low income people that
Right.
help keep everyone alive. The
Right.
baristas and the fast food workers and the childcare providers and everyone that's a part of every city.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I agree. Lindsay, what about you?
Well, you all covered it beautifully. I think I would just add, we at Seattle Foundation, we have launched a strategic plan last year that was driven by our community-led organizations, really highlighting sort of 3 issues, and it kind of speaks to what you brought up, Rachel, this idea that nothing happens in isolation, right? Everything is connected, and so we are really focused heavily on affordable housing across the spectrum, and I think that's important to know or to think about when we talk about affordable housing. That's everything from folks that are sleeping outside to people who own multi-million-dollar homes. It is a full spectrum. And we tend to really focus on a very particular slice of it, but we don't necessarily always have those deeper conversations about how one thing impacts another. And I bring it up because I think one of the big issues around housing that we see, and I will just name, I worked in housing and homelessness for several years at Chief Seattle Club, building housing and emergency shelter, and something that we would see regularly. Chief Seattle Club, if you don't know, is an organization that works with the urban native population in Seattle, and recently started to build housing of its own to meet a need that wasn't being met elsewhere. One of the things we would see a lot were folks that were on 3rd generation of homelessness, right? Because it has been unstable and unaffordable for so long for communities, particularly communities of color, that we have this sort of revolving door in the housing system, which exacerbates the problem, right? You can get folks into housing, but if they can't afford to stay in it, out they go, right? And then we all sit together and say, well, what do we do about this epidemic of homelessness? We're throwing millions and millions and millions of dollars at it, and it's not getting any better. But the key piece is that for so many folks, and as you all uplifted, it's getting harder to stay in that housing, to maintain that housing. And the worse that gets, the harder that gets, the deeper the crisis gets. The other 2 sort of areas that we're really focused on are childcare and transit-oriented communities, because what we know is if we can co-locate affordable housing and childcare with accessible transit, that's a win for everybody, right? That also roots people in a community. And so all these conversations we have about displacement, about folks not being able to feel secure and feel grounded where they live, is because you have to move around to find what's affordable. But if we can start to think differently about how the structures and the systems that exist can work together to really create a full system that supports families, that supports people in the city, I think we get a lot further down the road.
Absolutely.
Can I add
Yeah,
one
please.
thing to that? Because Lindsay is making me want to really talk about a comment that underlies all of this from the entire spectrum. We are short not hundreds, thousands of housing units, right, across the region. Thousands, from supportive shelter and supportive housing, where you create, like my friend Sharon Lee at Lehigh, housing that has supportive services built into it, workforce housing. And so what Lindsay's talking about, and I think what's being pointed out is, for families that are struggling with meeting housing needs and then all of the other basic needs, they're living further and further and further away, right? So I need 3 buses plus light rail to get anywhere near a job center. That's where I'm being forced all the way out to. So people will essentially drive, train, or bus to affordability. And that might be really far away from a place like Seattle. So we're exacerbating the problem because of a severe housing shortage. So our organization, we've been around for a long time. We've built hundreds of units. We're right now trying to build, and we'll create a market where one doesn't exist. So speaking of transit-oriented development, we're building a thing called OLU, which means to gather in the Coast Salish language. It is a 68-unit limited equity cooperative right at the light rail station, right? The market won't do this, right? It takes affordable housing developers to sort of step in and get creative to address a need and a problem, right? So
Why wouldn't the market do it?
it's not a moneymaker for them, quite frankly. And it's hard to finance these things. I mean, we have our own struggle with financing, housing, where we don't necessarily have access to the LIHTC program, low-income tax credits, which are usually used to build affordable rental housing. We don't build rental housing, so we have to come up with different financing methods. But this is important because if we can be successful in creating this, perhaps then other developers will follow behind us and start creating some of the solutions that help to push back against the 3 and 4 and 5 buses all the way to get close to my job because I can only afford to live way the heck out there.
Yeah, absolutely. We're kind of talking about it, but I want to get into what each of your organizations is doing to address some of these issues you identified. We've all talked about housing. I think that's what we're going to mostly be focusing on. So, Daryl, I know you mentioned a few things that you're doing, but can you go a little bit more into detail about that shared equity co-op that you talked about?
Sure. So the concept here, and these are very common back east, where I'm originally from, in New Jersey, Philadelphia, New York. If you own an apartment in New York City, 95% of the time it's a co-op. So they're not very, very well known here, but this essentially is shared equity housing. So we build the 68-unit, gorgeous, deep green building, and unlike a condominium where you actually own your 4 walls and your door and all of that kind of stuff, you collectively with your neighbors own the entire building. There's a blanket mortgage over the whole building, and you own what are called shares. But those shares can be passed down to your kids, to your heirs. It gives you the right to stay in your home for your entire life. Right? And you can then sell those shares in the open market. So the beauty of this is it's income restricted. You can't buy a place in this cooperative unless you make 80% of the area median income, which for one person right now is about $79,000. So
let's think about
let's think about that, right?
Crazy.
So if you make that much, if you're at 80% area median income as a single person, to afford to buy the median home price in Seattle, you gotta like quadruple your income, basically, right? So in a cooperative, you have the opportunity to buy shares and own something that will grow in value. Now, if you stay 3 to 5 years and you decide to sell your shares because you wanna move, you wanna have a dog and you want a bigger backyard or something, great, awesome. There's nothing limiting about your income once you purchase. But when you go to sell the shares, this is where the math comes in, you can only sell it to another income qualified family. Because of the investment we have going into it, we are duty bound, and by all of the sort of governing documents in it, the development, it must be sold to another affordable family for 99 years. So you're creating an affordable home ownership opportunity adjacent to light rail in the city of Seattle that actually can make a difference.
Wow.
That's one solution.
Yeah, that's an incredible one. Lindsay, do you want to talk a little bit about what your organization is doing with the Evergreen Impact Housing specifically?
Yeah, so we launched Evergreen Impact Housing Fund in partnership with community organizations and Washington State Housing Finance Commission about 15 years ago. And basically the purpose was really to do exactly what Daryl's talking about. Make it more affordable, make it more accessible, particularly for developers who don't have an easy in this market, right? How do we help? How can we come in and provide some low or no cost, no interest loans to be able to pair with other financing so that these affordable housing projects can see the light of day? Because what we know is it's incredibly difficult, especially if you've never built anything before. Really hard to get a financial institution to bet on you. And there's not enough grant money in the world. Tell me if I'm wrong. I work in philanthropy. There's not enough grant money in the world that's going to build a multi-family, multi-unit affordable housing project. It's just those, they are many, many, many millions of dollars, right? $50, $60 million on average. And it's getting more expensive because land is getting more expensive and all the costs to build, right? And so EAHF has been a really successful program that has combined contributions from national philanthropy, local philanthropy, and then local financial institutions to help support this market and be able to open the door, in particular to developers of color, to come in and be able to have a share and be able to build for their community or with their community in mind, right? It's for everyone, but it's in particular thinking about how do we meet a need that historically has been shoved to the side. And so we're incredibly proud of that program. We're actually just about to launch. I won't get ahead of it because you'll see a press release coming.
Break some news.
But we're a new project's about to open. We're really proud of that is a mixed affordable housing and market rate project, which is, I think, all told about 350 units. I might have that number not quite right, but it's in that ballpark, and it's in Renton.
Okay. Well, we'll keep an eye out for that. Very incredible work. Jasmine, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about what your organization is doing to address some of these issues.
Yeah, FutureWise does a lot. With my work, then, as I said, I'm on the Complete Communities Coalition as one of the co-chairs, and so we're working on the Seattle Comprehensive Plan and making sure that we're planning for the next 20 years in a way that includes all of us, that we're building those vibrant communities. And with the comprehensive plan, it's a massive document that outlines what are our goals, what are the policies that are going to help us reach that goals, and where are we going to let people live. And that's one of the biggest determinations of how much housing we can put into the city. Capacity is just one factor. We also need to factor in how many are actually going to get built, and so there's different numbers that float around. But how do we make it the best city that we possibly can? We also do work with the Eastside Housing Roundtable, and one of the things that we're really excited about is that Wilburton is an area in Bellevue that's going to be getting a vibrant new community, a lot of really great housing, and a land use code amendment that's coming up pretty soon, and it's right near a light rail station, and so really re-envisioning that transit-oriented development. There's the legislative work on middle housing that's all coming into effect now. At the end of the month is a major deadline for jurisdictions to decide how they're going to meet the moment and provide that gentle density and infill housing that used to be allowed, and then we made it single family zoning only, and so bringing back some of those options. And then we have our enforcement arm, the legal team, that makes sure that everyone's following the Growth Management Act and that their comprehensive plans are following what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, I did some research, and essentially what I come to gather is that your company or your organization makes sure cities are following the rules and also comes up with better rules for the future. And one example was challenging the Mercer Island Comprehensive Plan because they weren't having enough diverse housing. So that's something that your organizations do. It's very, very, very cool. Daryl, is there something on that book you want to mention about home ownership?
Oh, yeah, I suppose I should. Can you still hear me out there? Okay, good, thank you. First, I want to give props to Lindsay and Seattle Foundation. It's really nice when people say things about your organization when you're not saying it about yourself. So Seattle Foundation has been an incredible support to Homesite and the communities we serve. I talked a little bit about housing supply, and we have a program called the Field Order 15 Fund that actually empowers Black, brown, and female developers to become aspiring and successful developers, because nationally, the groups I just described make up about 0.5% of developers. These developers locally are developing with their communities in mind, right? And it's very difficult to break through. And so we provide, through the Field Order Fund, because of organizations like Seattle Foundation and others, an upfront grant for feasibility, which is the hardest money to find. That's how many credit cards can I max out. We provide a very low interest pre-development loan as they move toward creating those units in the permitting process. And we put that together, getting them to a warm handoff with construction financing so they can create units. So far, the Field Order Fund is over 500 units in feasibility right now, over 65 units that are moving toward permits, which means we'll actually get Black, brown, and female developers creating the housing units that we desperately need, thinking about the communities that they come from. So props to Seattle Foundation and others for that. That is huge, right? Really, really important. So that's what I wanted to get that in there. And I forgot your other question, so.
Oh, that's okay. I was going to ask you about creating a better home ownership program, and if there's something for you.
Yeah, so it's really difficult, I think, to think about the pickle we find ourselves in without really thinking about the history and the context of how we got here. The racial wealth divide, for example, in Washington State, 4 in 10 Black families have 0 net worth, right? Which means that the business didn't get started. I wasn't able to send that kid to college, right? I wasn't able to survive a catastrophic health, crisis because I don't have equity. There's 0 equity in my life. There's 0 net worth. And this is not by accident, right? So we all understand the history of our country, I would think, here in the Puget Sound region of how we got here. But there's some real facts that don't get mentioned a lot. So I'll read to you, if you'll allow me for just about 30 seconds here. Cities in the suburbs in the West were also blanketed by racial covenants between 1935 and 44. W.E. Boeing, founder of the Boeing Aircraft Company, developed suburbs north of Seattle. During this period and after World War II, the South Seattle Land Company, the Puget Sound Mill Company, and many others constructed more suburbs. These builders all wrote racially restrictive language into their deeds. The result was a city whose African American population was encircled by all white suburbs. Boeing's property deed stated, for example, quote, "No property in said addition shall be at any time sold, conveyed, rented, or leased in whole or in part to any person or persons not of the white or Caucasian race," end quote. An African American domestic servant, however, was permitted to be an occupant. Within Seattle itself, numerous high neighborhood associations sponsored racially restricted covenants that were formed in the first half of the 20th century. So if you've not read The Color of Law, you really ought to, because we like to think here in Puget Sound that we're super progressive and we're just in this pickle we're in, but there's actually a lot of history and context of how we got here. And redlining, of course, was very prominent here in Seattle and the Puget Sound area. We had sundown laws. Like most of the rest of the country, almost every municipal area in the country had redlining laws. We also had racially restrictive covenants here that prevented families from actually buying property in certain areas. So you constricted supply, you made it impossible to get a loan. And so when we see the wealth divide right now and the housing divide, which is about 32% of Black families in Washington State are homeowners, and for white families, it's about 68%. So it's about double, a little bit more than double. And in fact, we had a higher home ownership rate before 1968, when it was perfectly legal to use race to discriminate against folks in housing, rental or otherwise. The number's actually gone backward. Part of that's exacerbated by cost that we're talking about here tonight, but also if you didn't have generational wealth, if your grandparents couldn't own and your parents had difficulty owning, that's why you have to show up at Homesite to get all kinds of down payment assistance and a first mortgage you can afford. So I'd love to see a day where Homesite doesn't need to exist, but that's not the case right now. So it's a real problem.
And I know that there's the Black Home Initiative that's trying to get 1,500 new low-income to medium-income Black home owners by 2027. So I know there's organizations that are working on combating some of this. Do you guys have reactions to some of this?
Yeah, I mean, we're sitting in the shadow of Queen Anne. Right over there is the hill that has many of those racially restrictive covenants. And as someone who's on the Queen Anne Community Council, it was not lost on me. how built in to the way that the community is set up, that
Right.
people like me weren't normally thought of in that way.
Yeah.
And there's I don't know if it's a joke, but that we have in urbanism, that it's all the same map. You look at the redlining map and it's the same map. You look at voting patterns and it's the same map. And you look at different housing discrimination, it's all the same map. And so when we think about the work that we do in zoning and the opportunities that's in front of us for comprehensive planning, when we're planning for all of us, then we should be looking at how do we make sure that there's space for all of us. When we look at multifamily housing and where we can have affordable housing, that's the same map. If we're not allowing multifamily housing in neighborhood A, B, or C, then we can't have affordable housing there if we aren't able to build for it.
Educational outcomes, health outcomes, all of that. Shockingly, they follow the same doggone maps that we had years ago when it was perfectly legal to do this stuff. So,
Wow.
you know, it's it didn't just happen by accident.
Absolutely, and thank you for sharing some of that. We only have a few more minutes, so I want to look forward. I know it goes fast. I want to look forward, and you've all mentioned a lot of really incredible work that your organizations are doing, but what else can we do to create a vibrant community, and how can other people get involved? What is some of your advice? What do you hope for the future? Lindsay, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, well, I work in philanthropy, so you know where this is going to go. No, truly, I mean, you know, obviously, if you're able to give to community organizations that are doing amazing work like these two, please do. And Field Order 15 is actually a really great example. We actually had, at Seattle Foundation, we have about 1,000 donor-advised funds, and we had 10 fund holders who decided they wanted to come in and co-invest in that program, right? That was $665,000 that otherwise wouldn't have gone towards Field Order 15. So, you know, that's 10 people who said, I've got some amount of money I can put in here. Now, most of us don't have that kind of money laying around. So, the other thing I would say is, you know, these conversations, have them with your friends, have them with your family. Talk about the history, even when it's hard. Talk about the things we're facing, even when it's uncomfortable. Because at the end of the day, the more that we understand the implications of votes that are happening at the city council level, votes that are happening at the county council level, levies that are coming out, ballot measures, budget cut conversations. I think sometimes, you know, we read headlines, especially today, I do it all the time. I read a headline and move on. But I don't go deeper always to think about what's underneath that headline, right? How do we get here? Because if you can trace how we got here, then you can start to see how do we move forward? How do we do something different? And I think, you know, the comprehensive plan is a really good example in the city of Seattle. That was a multi-year and multi-community effort. And by the time it got to city council had turned over, and there were a lot of feelings, there were a lot of thoughts about the recommendations in that a lot of us in community advocated really hard for, because we knew these were solutions that were going to work. But at the political level, there were other considerations, and they stopped talking about what community was asking for and what community knew was the right thing to do. Now we're starting to see a little bit of shifting, right? We're starting to see some different dialogue happening, which is great, but that starts with us. Because the more of us that do that, the more we can communicate to the folks who make the decisions what are the right choices and decisions and investments to make.
Yeah, so donate if you can, hold our city leaders accountable, educate yourself, and talk about it. Very well said. Yuta, I'll give you last two words, last two answers. What can we do moving forward?
Well, definitely get involved in the comprehensive plan process. It's right in front of us. Actually, tomorrow there's a select committee meeting where they're reopening the conversation, setting the stage. They had just worked on the interim legislation for making sure that they met the deadline on middle housing, but now looking at the whole package. What are our goals? What are the policies that get us to those goals? And there's a lot of people that are invested in the status quo, and what we just talked about here is that we have a huge gap to fill that can't be met by the status quo. And so finding the time, the voice, the way to show that you're in support of a vibrant community, that you want your neighbors to have homes, that you want choice and options and joy in your community. Those are going to be so important for all of our leaders to hear.
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead.
Everything that these two brilliant women said, do that, right? But also, it's really easy to, we're bombarded with just the bad every day. You read your news feed, you just want to pull the blanket, make it go away. Can I wake up and, there be a different administration as one example, right? But I think it's really important to not pull the blanket up, to really continue to be in dialogue with one another about how some of the choices that are coming from DC, how this actually affects us truly on the ground, right? And how do you support organizations that are working in direct opposition to some of the rhetoric and some of the policy choices we're hearing? In the housing sector, we're looking at a world of hurt here. It's not going to get better. It potentially could get a lot worse. So being informed in how that plays out locally is really important. So now is a great time to sort of figure out, okay, that's a really bad headline. What's underneath that? What actually is the policy that's going on, and how does that affect the community that I live in now? And then what can I do about it locally? Because there are things you can do. Being involved with the comp plan, I was a planning commissioner many years ago. Planning's sexy. Read it. This is the roadmap of
Planning
how we
is
want our
sexy.
communities to grow, right? It really is, right? Support organizations that are making a difference on the ground, because many of us are facing pretty draconian cuts from the federal government, and it makes it a lot harder for us to do the very things we've talked about this evening. So there's definitely a way to be involved, and this is the start of it, coming to conversations like this.
I was just going to say, you coming tonight is a good start. Jeff, is it, I got 7:15 time or Jackie?
Okay, so thanks Rachel, thanks our speakers. We're gonna take a 10-minute break, so your challenge is to talk to a friend, talk to somebody new, and figure out what questions you wanna ask after a really excellent discussion. Welcome back. We now have our audience Q&A. So Jeff Carter, over here, will bring the mic over to you. And in order to get as many questions as possible, does this help? Please keep your question to about 10 seconds and concise, please. So Rachel, it's back to you.
Okay, I think it's over to you, Jeff, right?
Yeah, what
questions do you have?
What questions do you have? I'll just run around and be one of those talk show hosts. Okay.
You weren't ready to be first, were you?
Okay. So I have a couple of questions, but I'll stick with my first and leave space for others. Daryl, you talked about the deficit of thousands of housing units, and I'm gonna say I don't work in homeless housing services and housing first folks, but I'm adjacent to it. And I have heard a different theory of we have thousands of vacant housing units that are going underutilized or could be repurposed. And I'm wondering, like, from all three of you, like, is that just a theory? Is there probability or possibility of, like, investing in repurposing of some of the spaces in our city to develop more housing availability, and what could that look like? That's one of my questions.
I'll start and then let colleagues answer. I don't work in that part of the continuum. You may very well be correct. What I do know is in terms of workforce housing and housing that's available as affordable home ownership opportunities, that I absolutely know we are really, really super well short. It's super hard to develop in Seattle. It takes a long time. It's expensive. And so part of our programming is how do we create those opportunities and also empower other developers to do that in the communities that they want to serve. So that's where we put most of our focus. I sit on the board of the Housing Development Consortium of Seattle-King County. I have lots of colleagues. There's about 100 of us that do stuff other than what Homesite does. And so they're working in that portion of it, but you know, Lindsay and Jasmine may know more.
Look, I'll start with, you know, numbers are numbers, right? And they come from somewhere. And I don't think they're necessarily wrong, but I think we put too much of an emphasis on production, and we don't look at the other aspects of the affordable housing system, right? I can say, having worked in the deeply affordable, so that 0 to 30, 0 to 50 AMI range of housing, we had turnover, but rarely had vacancies that lasted because there weren't enough people to fill them. The system itself is very hard to navigate, takes a long time, and subsidies, there is not a dearth of subsidy, right? So you have to have income. You have to have some sort of income, or you have to get into a heavily subsidized housing project that you can have a runway to get some income, right, to be able to maintain your housing. I think, you know, one of the things that I would love to see us talk a little bit more about is, what does it look like to streamline that process? What does it look like to pull those numbers apart and really understand where the vacancy exists, or where the lack of units exists, right? Because it is not, I think those numbers, one, are statewide, first off, right? And so we know Eastern Washington has a very different, rural communities, it's a very different picture than it is here in Seattle. But I would love us to talk a little in a different way about, when we say vacant units, what that really means. And are they truly vacant? Or is it that it's so difficult to get through the process that they're sitting for months, so they look vacant, but really there's folks to fill them, right?
Yeah, like going upstream on the problem. Yeah. And do you want to add anything, or do you want another question?
No, I mean, no.
Okay. We got a couple over here.
Daryl, you mentioned that Seattle takes a long time to build stuff and it's very expensive to build here. If you had a magic wand and you could wave it and make it faster, would there be any policies that you would address, or specific things that you would change to make it faster and cheaper to build here?
I think that there are moves in that direction. You know, we, as we're developing this cooperative, we've had great cooperation from the Department of Planning and Land Use, whatever the heck it's called these days. It was called DCLU when I was working at the city a whole lot, many years ago. So I think it's getting better, but we again support developers that are working in Pierce County and Tacoma, and it's just a lot faster, frankly, and time is money, right? And so one of the policies I'd point out that I'd like to see a little bit more widely, you know, used is the community preference policy, right? So when you can get a building done, community preference allows us to serve those segments of the population that are facing real pressures in terms of gentrification. So you got services here in South Seattle, but you're forced to live way the heck out now because of affordability. I can serve you first as a potential buyer in the cooperative, right? If you are someone who's in the community now, but you're feeling that pressure to leave, community preference allows us to serve you first. So, you know, we still have fair housing laws. We don't have, you know, housing that says it's specifically for this member of the community, but we do have creative things that the city of Seattle has done. Not the administration I worked in, can't claim credit for it, but I'd like to see that more widely used. And so if Seattle can continue to move in the trend of making it a little bit faster to get through the permitting process for affordable housing, for example, that would help us a lot. That would be huge for us.
Okay. Do we have another question out there?
Okay. I was wondering if you all think that like tech industry growth or just monolithic industry growth is inherently in conflict with some of the affordability initiatives or community growth initiatives, or if there are ways that we can like collaborate and make that growth.
No, we love Tech for Housing. Tech for Housing is an organization that really brings together the tech community and organizes for the housing that we need. They're great partners on the comprehensive plan and social housing and other real solutions to our housing crisis. I know that one of the scapegoats that has happened in Seattle is blaming like high-income tech workers for people being displaced. And I think one of the ways that we can address the actual policy gap is that we need more housing at all income levels so that the small number of housing, the shortage of housing isn't getting eaten up, because we all need homes. Everyone needs a home, and we need to meet the needs of everyone across every income level. And having partners all across different industries, different organizational backgrounds is critical.
Anything else you want to add?
I would just say I don't think it's helpful to vilify any particular segment of our workforce. I think the broader issue, the bigger issue, which really is a value conversation, is the incredible wealth inequity that we have in this city and this county. And if we could start to really have honest conversations about that and how that plays out in real life, because we say those words, but we don't necessarily dig into like, what does that really mean? And what it means is we have a housing system that values we don't see it as a right. We see it as a commodity. And if you're gonna look at basic needs as commodities that can be bought and sold in the marketplace to the highest bidder gets to set the price, you end up in the sort of crisis we're in addition to the intersections of racial inequity, gender inequity, right? Lots of other things play into that, but I just think it's a bigger conversation than that.
I think I'm going to add one thing to it that perhaps is a tiny bit controversial, which is I'd love to see more curiosity, right? We all, we're dancing around one phrase called gentrification, right? And I live in Southeast Seattle. If you think about the Central District here in Seattle, a historic Black community in Seattle, at one time in the late 70s, it was like 85% African American. It's 11% today. And so that curiosity, I'm coming to a new community, a new neighborhood, it'd be fabulous if folks were curious about the history of that community and be a part of the ever unfolding story and create some positive there, as opposed to, you show up and you don't have any questions or what was here prior or how can I be a part of the history of this community, as opposed to making the few folks that remain there feel like they're strangers in their own neighborhood. And that's a little harder to sort of quantify, but we know this to be true, right? We know that this actually happens. There are, oral histories of the folks that have been there for many years that talk about this. So I think in order to not have that feeling that we're talking about, this sort of us against kind of thing, and I don't have a pat answer for it, but I do know that curiosity about place and who's there and who makes the fabric of that community is important.
Okay. We've got a question over here.
The statement about the highest bidder actually caused me to have this question. And I look at it more as like there are certain groups of people that have greater access to the housing market than others. And before I ask my question, my husband is military, and we were purchasing a house in 2023, and we were using the VA loan. And with the VA loan, you cannot overbid on the house or else they won't approve the loan. And so we know going into the market that there were many homes we were never going to have a chance at purchasing because people were coming in and willing to completely overbid on the house and put cash down and stuff like that. So my question is, are there any policy ideas of how to address this highest bidder competition that happens within the market that leaves certain people having access and others not?
Yeah, great question.
Excellent question, and congratulations on becoming a homeowner. I know there was legislation here locally, I don't know where it went, about essentially corporate entities being able to purchase large amounts of real estate, rental, right? Which is, in my view, not a really good thing, because this also helps to drive the market in a way that makes it unaffordable. So we need to keep our eye on the ball on that, and seeing if that kind of legislation that can come in. I don't know if there's anything that could be done to deal with that part of the market. Our organization, is dedicated to serving, first-time buyers with, below market rate mortgages and a lot of down payment assistance. We also work in the space of anti-foreclosure work. We have specific dollars for veteran families to keep you in your home if things go sideways. So we try to, create and respond to community need through the products and services we offer. But the issue you're talking about is, I'm not sure what policy could be created to get around that, the sort of bidding frenzy. And, happily for many of the clients we've served, we've actually run into lovely, gracious home sellers that actually want to serve a first-time buyer that is an affordable buyer. So sometimes they might actually, believe it or not, take a tiny bit less money because they really want that family that's using a home site mortgage to have an opportunity. But that's not going to move the needle largely in terms of what you're talking about. That's a really difficult issue.
I'll just share real quick. I don't know either, but that's a great idea. So, anyone wants to take that up, Jasmine?
I was saying, you should write
Just
it.
saying. But one thing I will say, similar to the work that Homesite is doing around a cooperative housing model. So there's some other organizations here in the city that do their community land trusts, and so they do affordable home ownership that, it caps how much profit basically you can make off of your home when you sell it, right? And you don't own the land. I say this as someone who purchased a home through one of these organizations, because literally it was the only way my family could afford to live in the city, and I was commuting at that time 2 hours back and forth. So like 4 hours a day in the car, and my little one at the time, who was 4, one time we were sitting on 520 in traffic, not moving, and a bus was next to us, and she's like, "Can we just leave this car and get in the bus?" I was like, I wish we could, but sadly no, because we live way the heck up north. But there are, so no to your question, unfortunately, but there are models out there, and I think so that's a place to start, right? There are models, there are ways to look at home ownership, to look at housing from a different lens, which is, yes, you invested something, you should get something back. You should be able to have that home for your family in perpetuity if that's what you want, if you want to pass it on to your kids and your grandkids, whatever. But should you be able to make an exorbitant profit, right? Because you just happen to be at the right place at the right time and your home's in the right neighborhood. That's, again, a moral, ethical, and values question that I would love for us to have more conversations about. But just to say, there are models, there are ways, but we gotta have the will to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing that those different models are really important. There's what Homesite's doing. There's the Homestead Community Land Trust that's been mentioned. We fund a lot of mortgages for those folks too. Habitat for Humanity. We fund a ton of mortgages for Habitat here locally, in Spokane, in Pierce County. So the more that alternate models can also be financed and developed, and we have more of them, just grow these organizations to do more of what they do, that may be one of the approaches that provides more choices, so families aren't stuck in the situation that, if you happen to be using a VA loan, which is awesome, but it's really difficult. So those models really need your support.
Another question?
Okay, I'll ask my second question. And this is going to take us off the housing maybe a little bit, and it may be like bad detour. But
Give it a go.
I'm not an economics expert at all. Like, don't understand a lot about the economy. But what I do see is the connection to the continuing escalation of cost in our area. We're talking about housing predominantly right now because that's our one of our most basic needs, right? But the cost of everything, the cost of our cup of coffee at Starbucks has doubled in the last 20 years because the wages, the cost of supplies, the cost of whatever affects every single little thing that we purchase in our area. And then our sales tax and our tax structure in the Washington state and Seattle area also affects those costs that then prohibit us to be able to afford like the next level housing for our family or like whatever it is. Like, you know, just drinks out on a night like tonight is double what it would have been 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So I'm wondering, like, at what point do we break that cycle to bring it back to a level where, like, I might be dating myself, but like minimum wage was $4.25 and I could afford to rent my own apartment. Like, that can't happen for my kids that make a minimum wage of $20 an hour now. So I'm just like, where do we see ourselves going in all of this? That's my biggest, like, wonder.
Who wants to solve that problem?
Well, we do have the most regressive tax structure in the entire country, so we could kind of start with that. And they're incredibly regressive, and you know, it's expensive. And I think there's been efforts to try to change the tax system, and it's kind of failed. People really like our tax structure, apparently. I think most of us in the room could potentially agree that it ain't working for most people, right? So we could start there. And you know, the cost of labor, I think, for a healthy community, I mean, you need to be making about $25 an hour just as the floor, quite frankly. And so changing some of the tax structure, I mean, we live in an expensive part of the country, so you know, it's a really complicated web, but there are places, it seems to me, where we can get healthier, and the tax structure would certainly be a place I'd start.
Anything to add?
I was just going to say there are a number of organizations. We happen to fund all of them who are working on this exact issue, right? Which is our tax structure is designed in such a way we will never, if we keep going with what we've got, to your point, we will never really get to the root of the problem and fix it. And so there's a lot of good ideas out there that folks are throwing around. You know, there's this idea of, I said this to my boss the other day, and she was like, "Are you going MAGA on me?" I'm like, "No, baby bonds was not a MAGA idea. It's been around for a long time." But that, you know, it got some legs in the state legislature, this idea that every child who qualifies for Medicaid at birth would have a bond that would grow with them as they age, and then they would have access to that money at 18 to buy a home, to go to college, right? Basically, equity, right? Recognizing we don't all start on an even playing field. We don't all start in the same place. We have to acknowledge and accept that that's true, and there are things we can do, right? We've had pilots for guaranteed basic income in this state since the 70s. Pilot upon pilot upon pilot, they tell us all the same thing. And yet there is not the political will to enact a statewide guaranteed basic income, right? But there's a lot of folks, as things, you know, we shop at Trader Joe's and I can only buy 1 pack of eggs every time I go, and sometimes there's no eggs at all, right? As more and more of us who should be comfortable with the income we have are confronted with the fact that that is not gonna make it and it's only getting worse, there is more support and more interest in, you know, creative ideas, in challenging the tax structure that exists. I think, you know, again, having these conversations, but also be on the lookout, because there are folks that are organizing and they're working at the state level, county, and city level to address these issues. Really brilliant people out there doing that work.
Jasmine?
Yeah, I think that the first step is stopping the bleeding, and the cost of housing being one of those huge drivers, and the cost of delays on housing and addressing the shortage being one of the huge drivers of people's budget struggling, not stretching. I think that when we start rebalancing our tax code, then we can start thinking about how we're investing in our community so that the young people that are getting set up for the next generation are able to have all the things that they need. They're able to have health care. They're able to have guaranteed basic income. They're able to have schools with free meals, but also as we think about how we're building our communities, that we're reducing other costs, like they're able to take advantage of the youth ride free that we have and build out that transit expertise in Ride Transit Month so that they aren't necessarily thinking about having to invest in a vehicle because they're able to walk to their grocery store, walk to their future kids' play school. They're able to get all of their needs met in their community and really think about how they are able to build their wealth for future generations. But at the rate that we keep escalating, if we don't do anything to stop the bleeding on the cost of housing, for one, then we aren't going to be able to afford any of these things or be able to have our kids lay the groundwork for their own lives.
Definitely. This isn't solving anything, but from a small business perspective, I interview different business owners every week. And for example, raising the minimum wage, obviously that sounds like a good idea and we want people to make more. But I hear from these small business owners, I can't afford to pay my workers this. And it's not that their business model doesn't work. It's that they're not hoarding all this money for themselves. It's just so I just kind of want to speak on their behalf. And I know one example is the increase in minimum wage for tipped workers. And on the face, that seems really good. But when I talk to a lot of restaurant owners and bartenders, they're like, this actually is worse. And I don't want to get into all the details of that, but I think the lesson there is kind of what you talked about in the prep call is listening to people that are on the ground. Like, let's listen to the people and what policy at City Council actually does make sense to help people. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, and so it's a really good 2 cents. So we put on a thing called Plate of Nations every April for 2 weeks where we highlight South Seattle and South Park and Skyway, mom and pop, small ethnic restaurants, right? And for those 2 weeks, that's often their best 2 weeks of the year, right? We also do real hand-to-hand engagement with our business owners to get them to be online, get equipment, and many of these folks, English is a second language, so my very multilingual staff will sit with those business owners and listen. What are those challenges? And help them navigate the city of Seattle where there may be grants available or technology grants. So there are a lot of things we can do to have a overall healthier ecosystem to address the comment, but there's some larger things too around the tax structure and what have you. But there's not a one-size-fits-all answer. We need a multi-front approach.
Well, yeah, and I think some of it is U.S., some of it's Washington, some of it's Seattle. But I think we have time for maybe, one more, Jeff?
Hi. So I'm going to bring us back to housing and specifically zoning. So there's a lot of rezoning conversations happening. My particular lot it's up for rezoning for, I think it's up to 4 or 5 story multifamily home. My question is, when I see that houses are being rezoned and the thought is maybe you can add an ADU and a DADU, what happens instead is a developer comes in, scrapes the lot, puts up 3 units, and that $750,000, $800,000 house is now 3 $800,000 houses. So we're becoming more dense, but we're not becoming more affordable at all. And it's so I'm wondering, is there anything that you're working on or that you know about that is hoping to ensure that with the rezoning and increased density also comes affordability beyond a couple units that are set aside for lower income renters?
A very precise and complicated question. Thank you for that. Appreciate it. So we were partners in helping to do some of the down payment assistance for a group called Frolic in South Seattle that actually worked with a homeowner that had that ability, lots being upzoned, where they created 4 kind of mini units as a cooperative, essentially. And we'd love to see that be spread, right? So that a homeowner who says, hey, I could maximize value here, could you also work with a smaller developer that actually wants to be a little bit more socially conscious and say, well, let's create a space for you to have retirement income. Maybe one of your kid lives in one of the units and maybe you sell the other 3. So there are some creative approaches. We just need to get the word around and empower more of those developers that are not just looking to maximize, value and create. I've got a similar thing going on right across the street from my house right now. There's a land use thing up. They're going to just cut down all the big trees, right? And, we're pissed about this, right? We love those doggone trees. So could we find a developer that maybe wants to have a slightly different approach? Possibly, right? So if we can make those opportunities more available to those developers that are thinking a little bit more creatively about creating value for the homeowner, but also creating a lasting, community that will actually be supportive of the neighborhood. That's the goal. And so as we work with developers, we're encouraging that type of behavior, but it is an issue. And I would also just, again, can't recommend this more highly. Zoning was created originally to keep folks out, right? That's what it was for, right? So when we think about rezones and what have you, I'd love for people to think creatively about where this started and how do we actually create and share the wealth a little bit more. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. Anything you want to add before we close out?
I think what I'm thinking about is the opportunities to add more neighbors to our community and fill that need. I think about earlier we were talking about how the median house is $1 million, and so even 750 homes is a lot better than $1.5 million home on a lot. But yeah, so there's those thoughts as well, but then also looking at how we can be creative about the zoning code. And so one of the things that we were thinking about recently is with setbacks and when requiring a specific amount of front yards, that's what setbacks are, backyards or whatnot, means that a tree is end up going to come down because of the limitations that puts on the lot versus being able to move the development over to this corner so that backyard can keep that tree and whatnot. And so just thinking creatively about how we're approaching our zoning regulations and really manifesting the outcomes that we want to see.
Yeah. That's a really good question, a good thing to talk about. So I encourage you to take these back to your friends, like you said. One more round of applause for the speakers here. And I'll turn it back over to Jackie.
So thank you everyone for the wonderful questions, a wonderful discussion. Let's do one more round of applause for our speakers and for our moderator. So, thank you. And thank you again, a big thank you to Comcast, who is our sponsor tonight for Civic Cocktail. This is actually our last Civic Cocktail for the season. We'll be back in the fall, but we're taking a break for the summer. So when back to school comes to mind, think of us again, because events will be in your news feed for a little bit. But that's it. Thank you again so much to everybody coming out, and have a good evening.